and this was mentioned big time in Wizard.
So when I was a kid in the early 1990s, I grew up near Pittsburgh and it's sort of in the woods. I literally grew up in the woods, but in rural area. And my mom lived in Natrona Heights, which was slightly more suburban, but not really. There was a store called Value City, and I would go there to buy like Marvel Toy Biz figures. It was kind of like a closeout department store, so you'd get random things there that I just came from other places, probably overstock stuff like that. And one of the things I got, the first signed comic I ever got, was at Value City, and it came encased in plastic, and it was a copy of Zen Intergalactic Ninja. And I think I had at that point at least seen the Archie run of Zen, but I don't know that I was really familiar with the character. But a signed comic for me at that point in my life was shocking. I didn't know, I don't even think I fully grasped the idea that people made these things yet. Although I was a Wizard the comics, Wizard the guy the comics was kind of big at that time too, so it was making the creators very apparent. But it was my first signed comic, and my first, I guess, what you would call an indie comic compared to like at that point a lot of Marvel and DC and something. I might have, I was probably aware that Ninja Turtles at that point had started out as an indie comic, but I didn't have any of those. Again, if I had a Ninja Turtle comic, it was an Archie Comics version. So I am thrilled to be joined by the very man who signed that comic that somehow found its way to a plastic case to Value City in Natrona Heights so that I could find it at about 10 years old. Thank you, Steve, for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Josiah. And uh, something along these lines happened today, as a matter of fact. A fellow posts on Twitter, which is still up and running,
For the
despite
time
me.
being.
Uh, he shows a picture of a Zen comic, actually the chromium cover J. Lee edition that I signed, but with something you may be unaware of. I was signing comic books with a DNA gene pen.
Whoa.
Now, there's a bunch of these that are out there in the world, and like I said, a fellow posted one of them today. It was a company back in that day that took your DNA. I think I had to like do a swab, okay, sent it into them, and this was mentioned big time in Wizard, the aforementioned Wizard magazine that you mentioned. And so there's a bunch of comic books out there signed by me with my DNA in the ink.
Wow. Mine seems suddenly disappointing. As cool as it is, it doesn't seem as great, but that's amazing. It seems very like a 90s sort of futuristic idea. Like, I remember as a kid that when they cloned the sheep, that was a huge deal that
Yeah,
around that time and those kind of things. So
yeah.
very cool. So tell me then, Steve, I guess, so what is your background prior to the creation of Zen? So where did you come from? I grew up in the Pittsburgh area. You're from back east, correct?
I'm from New York, as a lot of people can tell when they hear my
I
accent.
guess so from the accent alone, but yeah.
Yeah. Um, uh, Eventually, after I got married, my wife and I moved to the state of Maine. And it was there in Maine that I was running my advertising agency. I owned an ad agency. And I went to a potential new client up in Maine called Cody's Old Fashioned Ice Cream, which, by the way, Yankee Magazine, which is like the arbiter of all things cool in New England, said that Cody's was, quote unquote, the best damned ice cream in New England. So this was good ice cream, right? So I go and I meet the owner of the company, the co-owner, Nancy Cody, and I see all these very intriguing, intricate pen and ink illustrations pasted all over her office. And I point them out and I say, boy, those are really cool. And she says, yeah, my son Dan Cody, did those. And Steve, I'll give you our advertising account if you'll have Dan do all of the artwork for Now, not being stupid, I immediately said, of course. Plus, I thought his art was really cool. Right? So I met Dan, and long story short, we collaborated on a comic book called Zen Intergalactic Ninja. And that's how that started. And that was, well, we met around 1985. Um, the first issue of the book came out in November of 1987, like 35 years ago, almost to this day.
Crazy. Yeah, I was 5 years old at that time. So I was born in
Wow.
'82. So I was your prime demographic. It's funny because that's how old my daughter is now, is 5. So sort of having her to help me think of, see the world through her perspective kind of reminds me of how I saw things then. And it's
Yeah.
cool to get to visit characters I encountered. Although, like I said, I encountered Zen probably another 5-ish years later, and sometime in the early '90s. I can't recall exactly when, but I'm guessing it was around like '92-ish, which would have made me 10. But it
Yeah.
just helps give a perspective on the way she sees the world. It really helps me remember how I saw the world, and it just
Yeah.
that's been the coolest thing about parenting for me. And she'll ask a question that I could see myself asking, and uh, she is also a fan of these kinds of characters, because you can see I surround myself with. We're in the process of moving, so there's actually a bit less.
Yeah.
This is actually interesting. This will be probably the last video I record, I think, in this house, at least the last quote interview type of video before we move. So I'm kind of excited as a collector. It's like, how do we get to display my stuff in the new house? But there's less stuff out here. But that was a lot of
Right.
the toys and things I have are from those formative years, and the the stories that I would tell that were inspired by comics like that I would live out in action figure form, and that was
Yeah.
how I sort of first. I always say that's, as a writer, that's where I got my start writing. I would tell these stories. In particular, I always tell a story. As a kid at Christmas, my mom would do layaway at the time, so I would have this. I would go pick out the toys,
Yeah.
and she'd put them on layaway at the department store, and I would know what I was getting. So I would have, like, say one Ninja Turtle was waiting to rescue his friends were captured, and then Christmas Day would be the release. So it'd become these overly elaborate storylines for characters like Zen to live out. So,
Hmm.
so once you created the first comic and that started, how did that, how did that grow then to the point where, so it was basically an indie comic at that time, correct?
Yeah. I can speak quite definitively to that, and it has to do with the fact that I owned an advertising agency. So Dan and I, we self-published the first issue of Zen, no, November 1987, black and white book, distributed, went right through to Diamond, which back then was basically who was distributing books. And the book sold relatively well. We thought it was phenomenal. I think we had like orders for about 3,500 books, which, a book coming out of nowhere, a black and
Mm-hmm.
white book out of Maine. So I perceived we had something that could build. Now, because I owned an ad agency, I was a member of something that exists to this day. It's called PR Newswire. It's the preeminent service that distributes press releases for everything from multinational companies to other companies. But you have to be a member of PR Newswire in order to utilize its paid services.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, okay, I'm going to put out a press release about Zen so I can see if we can really get some traction here. So spend the money. We put out a release which had a picture of the cover of the first issue, which I have right here as a little visual aid. This is book number 1.
Very cool.
And you'll notice Zen looks quite alien here, right? At the time, this was around the time Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, was out, and it had a very definitive alien image on the cover, right? So I put out the release, and the hook of the release is that, well, Superman is an alien. He's from Krypton, but he looks like a human.
Yeah.
now there's an independent comic book called Zen with a real alien-looking hero, right? So you put out the release. What happens when you put out a press release is you have no idea if anybody is going to pick it up, any of the media, right?
Mm-hmm.
So about 2 weeks after I put this release out, a business associate of mine says, Steve, go down to the newsstand and pick up a copy of USA Today. I go, and the entertainment section was called the Life section of you. I think it still is. So I opened it up, and there on the cover of the Life section is Zen. That picture of him and a blurb about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the next day, or that very day, everything changed. Okay. And had I not done that, had I not put out that press release, I doubt very, very seriously you and I would be talking. So that's how that happened.
Yeah, it's just interesting too. I was thinking you were kind of when I like, at least from my perspective as a kid, maybe a few years later in the early 90s, you were kind of at the crest of a wave of alien stuff with aliens that look like aliens.
Yeah.
And that unique approach, because like there was the movie Fire in the Sky a few years later,
Yeah.
and the idea of that sort of like gray, big-headed, big-eyed alien that was threatening and scary, and that was a big trend. I grew up in the middle of the woods, and I was actually afraid that aliens would abduct me. So I think part of the appeal for me was actually an alien that kind of resembled that, but was the hero, was this good guy. And then you have the things that very much latch on to a kid of that age, intergalactic ninja, like I'm sold right there. You don't need to tell me anything else. That it's got space and swords, and
well,
I'm on board.
Another thing is the blue skin, okay, and it was just a perfect storm. He was an alien. He looked like an alien, but he was a good guy, and he was very cool, and he was this cool-looking blue-skinned figure that kids really were drawn to.
No, absolutely. And like I said, was one of those kids. So then what was the course of Zen? How did it, so it started from the indie comic. Then, for example, how did you get from then Zen is that to then like the Archie run and so forth?
Right. Well, how we got to the Archie line and how we got to the 2 Konami video games.
Yes, exactly.
And then the line of just toys.
The toys, exactly.
Figures, and then a plethora of other items, prepaid phone cards, notebooks, pens, pencils, Halloween masks. After that incredibly significant release appeared in USA Today, which was then, and I think still today, is like the largest circulation newspaper in the US. We were besieged by everyone. And we got a really excellent licensing agent who, I might tell you, also licensed, at least for a while, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And we just started riding that rocket ship, okay? When you get coverage in major media in the U.S., people tend to want to get involved with you, and that's what happened. And we also started, being very aggressive about PR. Because being in the advertising business, I understood how important that was.
Yeah, and I think that's something that probably a lot of creative people lack, frankly, that sense of that. I'm sure that it feels like a foreign world to a lot of people who might, conceptualize something like that, but then you got to tell people about it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just like there's that. I worked several years back at Disneyland, and I took surveys. It was an awful job, but I learned that essentially it's like a sales position, really. And with sales and with even a creative endeavor that you're trying to sell to someone, it's a law of averages where you just you got to let as many people as possible see it, because not everybody's going to buy it. I had to ask as many people as possible to take my survey, because 97% of them don't want to take my survey. So you've got to just keep plugging away to many people like you. So, but it was not a fun job, by the way, Disneyland survey person. Look, right at the gate. So you'd come into the park, you're here in the morning, ready to begin your magical day at Disneyland. Some people traveling from as far as Australia across the country, and I am asking for their email address. So the longest survey, though, took a minute. So it wasn't terrible, but I could totally sympathize with anyone who didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
So what was that? Was part of the concept of Zen driven by that idea of something that would latch on, or where did the concept for the story and the character come from?
Yeah, well, there have been a few people who kind of cynically believe that Zen was nothing more than a marketing ploy on my part. Okay. And I mean, again, I am a former advertising executive, so that is inbuilt in me, that I do know and like to promote things that I do. But the truth of the matter is, first of all, why did I call him Zen? I was very intrigued at the time by the philosophy, I'll call it, not a religion, of Zen Buddhism, because I felt it was very earthbound and very immediate and very much in the now. And so when I created this character, I wanted to embody the basic tenets of Zen. And that's why, to this day, the first word most people utter when they encounter Zen is, "Oh, he's so cool," because he's just a very cool character. But the way that story happened, the way Zen happened, is back in the 70s, I was living in New York City, and I was having several of my stories published by a company called Skyward. Skyward was like Warren in the sense that they had two flagship black and white horror kind of magazines. One was called Nightmare, and the other was called Psycho. And what would happen is you would submit your story synopses to Hershey Waldman, president of the company, and then he would show them to artists who would come by the office. There was no email or anything like that. There was no internet per se. So one of the stories I submitted was called Zen, and it was about this alien, right? But that story never got picked up by any of the artists. I was fortunate, however, that the very, very, very first story I submitted was selected by a guy named Jeff Jones. And Jeff, he also had this strip in, was it National Lampoon called Idol? Amazing artist. And he did the very first story that Skyward Publishing did of mine. It's called Sleep. And then I was also very lucky that the second story I wrote was picked up by Mike Kaluta. It's called A Cosmos Strain. And, those exist in those magazines, Nightmare and Psycho. But the story called Zen, which was similar to the story that ended up in our first issue, was not accepted by any artist. But to go a little further, so I had that one-page synopsis with me when I moved to Maine in like 1985, when my wife and I moved to Maine. And I was unpacking boxes, and one of them falls on the floor cracks open, and this one-page story falls out. A couple of days after that is when I met Dan Cody. And when we decided, after working together a bit on some of his family's ice cream stuff, I said, I got a story here. It's about this alien, and that's how it happened. So you're pretty kind of cosmic, if you ask me.
Very appropriate for Zen right there to come to life that way.
Yeah.
Another random question: does the ice cream still exist?
I believe it exists in the sense that you can buy it in certain supermarkets in New England.
Mm-hmm.
But the Cody's ice cream shops closed
Okay.
many years ago. But amazing ice cream.
I was close. That probably it never made it as far as Pennsylvania. So we were always kind of the outsider of New England states, where one of the 13 colonies, but not part of New England. So
yeah. Well, I mean, New York, technically, I guess.
Yeah.
About as far down as you can get New England to go.
Exactly. And well, as a sports fan, though, I would definitely, and a Steelers fan, I would not want an association with New England and the Patriots. So as a Pittsburgh kid, I couldn't tolerate that. But once you are in the 90s and Zen is become more of a thing, and there's toys, there's video games, which are now, those video games now are so, because I collect toys and I very casually collect video games, but those are so highly sought after, the games. And from what I understand, they're good games, but I've unfortunately never got to play them because it just missed me at the time for whatever reason. So
the NES game, there was an NES and Game Boy, both from Konami. The NES game was the very last 8-bit game they did before they jumped to 16-bit. And apparently they had incorporated a lot of the technology that then went into the 16-bit. So a lot of people to this day believe it's like one of the best, if not the best, 8-bit game you can find. Recently, one of them, in mint condition, sold for like $7,500.
Yeah,
I haven't seen any recently that are any less than about $5,000.
Yeah, and even like the loose cartridge goes for a lot, because like you said, since it was a later game, it was they had moved on to the Super Nintendo and the sort of the next generation of systems, so there's less people playing that. But at the same time, you have the developers for those games who have really peaked at their ability to get the most out of that system. And when I look at it, like when I look at videos, and I'll cut to some videos, it looks like it could be almost like it looks better than an 8-bit game. It's top level, like graphically, for the Nintendo, let alone I assume from what I've heard, the gameplay itself as well is really fantastic. But having not played it and just seen it, though, it's a game that if you can find it, if you find it at a thrift store, don't leave it on the shelf. That's all I'll say. So
they're very rare and they're very expensive to acquire.
And I wish I played it, just both as a fan of Zen and a video game fan. But like I was one of those kids that had moved on to the next generation of systems, so I didn't. I remember my mom just gave away our Nintendo because she's like, "Oh, you don't play with this anymore," and she gave away Nintendo and the games. And at the time, I didn't care, so I'm not like saying, "Hey, mom, how dare you?" Who my mom will probably watch this. I didn't care at the time because I had moved on too. But now I'm like, "Oh man, why did she have to do that?"
Yeah, I hear you.
So I guess we'll jump ahead quite a bit. But what is the present of Zen, and what is the future of Zen?
Yeah, very interesting. Got a lot going on right now, and it's pretty amazing to have an independent comic book around for 35 years and counting. It's been quite an odyssey, and a blessing to me. There's a lot going on right now. We're doing our first Kickstarter. It's going to launch very early in 2023, and it's it deals with a particular artist, and I'll tell you about this. I think you'll find it interesting. Back in the 90s, I'm back in New York now, and I'm walking through a mall, the Green Acres Mall in Valley Stream on Long Island. Originally, I grew up on, and I see this artist airbrushing T-shirts at the end of the hallway, and I'm totally stunned by his artwork. I just have to stand there for long moments looking at him. I eventually go up to him. His name at the time, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, was Joel Orbeta. And I introduced myself to him. He knew about Zen, and I was eventually fortunate enough to get him to work on a story with me. Um, in the ensuing years, he's become known as L'Amour Supreme. This is his name, L'Amour Supreme. And he's a world-renowned pop artist whose work has been displayed in galleries in Stockholm, Tokyo, Berlin, and all across the US. And the Zen story he worked on with me is the only complete comic book story he's ever done. Hence the name of the Kickstarter campaign that we'll launch in a couple of months is L'Amour Supreme's Zen. Now, I have a couple of other visual aids here that you need to see. This is the very first piece of art that Joel, now L'Amour Supreme, ever did. It's the cover to issue number 6A of Zen of our color series. Okay. Now, this book I'm holding here has since become the absolute rarest issue of Zen that exists, way rarer than that number one issue I showed you. If you go on eBay right now, you could find, say, about a dozen copies of Zen number one offered on eBay from a few $100s to a few $1,000s, right? But you cannot find one copy of Joel's first piece of art anywhere, not eBay, not anywhere. You can scour the internet, as I have sometimes for hours. This book only exists in the hands of very, very serious collectors. Now, Joel only did the cover of that 6A book. However, as I mentioned, he did a story with me, a story that ran across 3 issues. This is the first issue. This is the second issue. And this is the third issue. But he did not just do the covers. He did 71 pages of absolutely incredible sequential art. The story is called the Rawhead Saga. It's about an irradiated terrorist who causes havoc on the face of the earth, and the only thing stopping him is Zen. And of course, humanity is quite ungrateful about what Zen is doing. This story, which we're calling, L'Amour Supreme Zen, is the subject of the Kickstarter, and the art to this day is simply amazing. So that's a major event that's happening, and it constitutes Zen's first ever Kickstarter campaign.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'll share that to my small circle of people when it's obviously this video, whenever the links are live, they'll be attached to the bottom of this. So if you're watching this when that's live, check that link below. And if not, well, if you're watching this before that, certainly you said early next year, correct?
Yeah, I would say late late January, early February at the earliest.
Okay, so early February, January 2023. So
Right.
as you're watching this, unless you're watching this 5 years in the future, then you can probably go on eBay and find a copy of that. It all goes back to the collector looking for something. So, but definitely, hopefully, you're watching this beforehand or during that campaign, so you can get your hands on a copy of that collection, as I will be doing. It's just really cool. The art, looking at that stuff you shared, and you sent me some images prior to this of his, and it's just, I mean, I say Zen is, I was going to say, he makes Zen look so alien-like, but in a different way. As like the earlier Zen was that almost more petite, but fit like a Bruce Lee with an alien head almost kind of body. Whereas there's more power in the Lemore. It's a different, a more dynamic in a different way. And they're both interesting and valid, but it's just a cool new dimension to the character.
Yeah, like there.
Yeah, like that's very superheroic, but in a way that if that were a more human character, that would be, it wouldn't work. But on Zen, it fits because it's this alien creature. So it's just really cool to see, and I'm excited to read the story, obviously, as well as a fan of the character and stories and Zen stories. So anything else on Horizon 4 Zen besides that?
Yes, there's something else that's very exciting. I can only say so much, but I'm currently writing a Zen screenplay with a very well-established director.
Awesome.
Can't say much more than that, but it is my belief that in calendar year 2023, there will be a Zen movie that either is in production or actually released. And that's another real long odyssey. Zen had been optioned for TV. He'd been optioned for film twice. All of those deals, for one reason or another, fell through, which is not untypical in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
But I do believe that now, with the insatiable appetite and need for content that the streaming media alone has, I think it's more likely than ever that there will be a Zen film in the near future.
Yeah, and I think Zen hits just the appeal. I think is interesting. You could say what it is to a lot of people, and there's enough something to grasp on that they would want to at least engage and figure out what it is. And there's also part of the motivation with a lot of the streaming is the nostalgia, and there's nostalgia attached to Zen as well. So I think hopefully that can latch on. Obviously, there's the audience of the Josiahs here and people like me that know Zen, not as well as I didn't read all the runs of Zen, but I read like that Archie run particular was the main one I read. And then some of the one it was like under the Epic banner at that time. Those are the ones that I was able to get my hands on. And the Archie was just obviously the easiest because those were the ones that were in the grocery store.
Right.
So those were on the old school grocery store spinner rack, and I could grab that comic there, and they would have, but the other stuff I'd have to actually go to the comic book store for, which was, growing up in the middle of the woods, a little bit more of an excursion for me. So one thing would be interesting is, did you buy a t-shirt, an airbrush t-shirt off of him at that time?
He did do a t-shirt for me. And that t-shirt became essentially that piece of art on the cover of issue number 6A, the book you can't find anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But there was also an airbrushed version of that t-shirt art that ended up being used by the Interleg International Company, which issued the Zen vinyl model kit. That is again a highly sought for item. The fellow who sculpted it, Sean Nagel, he sculpted the first Spawn vinyl model kit. And it was based upon Jay Lee's piece of art on our chromium cover.
Yeah, and Jay Lee, people know Jay Lee now, but especially at that time, he was one of those big artist on Wizard would always have the top 10 artists little
Yep.
thing, top 10 writers. And, it would be like Jay Lee and those kind of guys. Like it would just, for me as a kid, again, that was what opened up before the internet came not too long after that. Unfortunately, the internet's what killed Wizard, but a lot of other publications, but
Yeah.
that was how I would find out who made these things. I remember reading at the time the Fantastic Four movie, the Roger Corman one that was made just to keep the rights to the property kind of thing. I remember seeing pictures of it in Wizard, and there was pictures of the Thing and them in costume. And I was like, "My, there's going to be a Fantastic Four movie." And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized what happened with that. It was just one of those interesting things, but all because of Wizard that I had access to not these people, but understanding who they were and that they were people, and they'd have interviews with them. I remember I read an interview with John Byrne, and that was such a huge deal because at the time I could only afford X-Men classics because they were so cheap, and I couldn't afford like the older X-Men books that even then were out of my budget, when John Byrne and Chris Claremont were on that run.
Yeah.
So I could afford the X-Men classics. So I'm getting to see an interview with him, and he's doing like Next Men or something at that time. And, he's moved on from Marvel and DC stuff. But for me, it's like, just I get to read an interview with a comic book creator. Like that was mind blowing. So, and I got to say the same sentiment here. I am talking to one that I read your books at that time. That it's just amazing, and just thanks to technology, it's an amazing thing. So,
speaking of Jay Lee, are you aware that Mike Mignola also did a very iconic Zen cover?
I didn't.
What about the Sam Keith? Are you aware that
Sam Keith? Yes.
That one, Yeah.
Yes, Sam Keith. Yes.
That book was ultimately reprinted in 3D, and it's a top-selling book at every comic book convention that we're at. The next one of which I will be at will be LA Comic-Con. Just in the last day or two, our publisher decided to take a booth there, and I'll also be participating in a very interesting panel on the Saturday from 5 to 7 p.m. So just a lot going on.
Oh, cool.
The fact that I'm still doing all this and all these interesting things are occurring 35 years after I created this book with Dan Cody. It's a pretty amazing ride, I have to tell you.
No, it's awesome. And and Steve was going to join me at my booth for LA Comic-Con, but unfortunately with the whole move, we had to back out. Fortunately, they didn't bill me because I had already signed all the contracts and everything, and they were super cool about it. So I'll say that thanks to them, because I'm a dad and a writer who's mainly teaches English. Right. So as many writers do, that $1,200 for a booth means it's a bigger dent in my wallet, especially when we're about to buy a new house in Huntington Beach, because that's not cheap. But thank you. I appreciate the fact that you were going to do it, and hopefully in the future that you'll get to do something again, do a signing like that. I was working on, I was having someone do some art that I had to obviously stop that, but we were going to have an original kind of piece created to have at the event. But maybe we can hopefully revisit that in the future for the future convention. But I'm glad to hear you're going. That's awesome.
First Comics will have a booth there. I don't know the number of the booth yet, but anyone who wants to come by, as oftentimes happens with copies of Zen that they would like me to sign, I'm more than happy to do that, of course.
Awesome. So go to LA Comic-Con and say hi to Steve for me, because unfortunately, like I said, that's the move weekend, so I won't be there, but be there and experience the joy that I won't be as I'm moving boxes. But thank you so much to Steve once again for joining me. I really appreciate it. Like I said, it's cool for me to get to visit something that was significant to me in this way, that inspired me as a creative person and as a writer, to get to connect with the person who brought that into the world and get a little bit of insight into sort of how those things happened, and just have a conversation and get to learn about some things in the future. So be sure to check out the Kickstarter. The links again will be below once that is live, and we will see you here. Thank you for watching if you did, and again, thank you so much for watching if you did. Of course, you watched if you're listening to me. Thank you for watching, and thank you so much again to Steve. I appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you so much for your interest and enthusiasm, and I look forward to meeting you.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. This is our first meeting in the communicating via email. We did speak on the phone, and this is the modern way people meet, I suppose, where you start with less contact and slowly become when you meet in person eventually. So this is our first face-to-face meeting, and then hopefully at some convention. And you're on the West Coast, right, Steve?
Yeah, I'm back permanently in LA.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm in Orange County, in Anaheim right now. We'll be in Huntington Beach. So, but LA is essentially home. That's our airport, so that's home. So
Exactly.
On a great day, I would. Thank you so much. On a better day, though, we'd fly through Orange County Airport because it's so not busy. But there are no flights to Pittsburgh from Orange County because Pittsburgh is not your most trafficked airport in the world. But
right.
Thank you again, Steve.
Thank you.